Welcome back to another episode of Beyond Funding. Today I'm really excited to be joined by Paul Playford, Senior Grants and Operations Officer for Benefact Trust. Paul's going to be sharing some top tips for budgeting when it comes to applying to the Trust, which is a really important part of the application process. So Paul, thanks for joining us again on the podcast. How are you?
It's a pleasure. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. I was wondering if you could start by explaining why budgeting is so important for churches and charities when it comes to accessing funding and wider project planning.
Well, in a nutshell, a well thought through budget demonstrates that the applicant has done their planning and their due diligence. All projects should begin with a clear understanding of what is wanting to be achieved and the impact that the project is going to make. And then this feeds into identifying what you need to make that happen. And then in turn, once you know what you need, that will feed into the budget. You could say that a good budget is the first step to ensuring that the project is sustainable, because when you plan your budget, you might throw up unforeseen costs, and having identified those, then that will mitigate the risk of the project failing once it's up and running.
So it's actually really valuable and not just a chore in terms of actually really knowing if your project is sustainable, it's going to run as it should, you've got all your ducks in a row, as it were.
Absolutely. I mean, often the temptation is to sort of, you just want to get going with the project, get it up and running as quickly as possible. And I totally understand that. I'd be the same. But really, for a project to succeed, putting all the planning in place at the outset, including preparing a good budget, will certainly ensure that the project has a fair chance of succeeding when it's up and running.
And I assume, we get applicants from all different types of organisations, and some of them may be volunteers that are putting in this application or part-time workers. And so I assume that the budget doesn't have to be really complicated, and it can be, something that anyone could do as such.
Absolutely. Our top tip for budgeting is keep it simple. All we need to know are those high-level figures. So, for example, if the project requires a new member of staff and you're wanting to apply for salary costs, we just need to know the total cost of that new role. We don't need all the component parts to be listed. If it's a building project, we don't need to see the tenders, the quotes from builders. We just need to know those high-level costs. And then, obviously, we also want to know where you're getting your funding from, apart from ourselves.
Obviously, different funders will have different requirements, but what percentage of funding do we ask to be in place when someone's applying to Benefact Trust, and why is this the case?
We ask for 30% to be in place before an application can be submitted. And the reason for this is that we get a lot of applications, and we really need to know when we're considering applications that the project is going to go ahead. So asking for 30% to be in place actually gives us some assurance that the project will ultimately come to fruition. I should point out that that's not to say that just because we ask for 30%, Benefact Trust will fund the remaining 70%. We will award a contribution towards the overall cost. We do look for a good plan of other funders and where the other balances are going to come from. The 30% can be made up of grants that you've already received, fundraising activities, secured pledges, and also you can include reserves, providing they're unrestricted reserves, and you're happy to contribute those towards the project.
Brilliant. And you touched upon it earlier, but I wondered if you could share what a well-prepared project budget looks like for us.
So if I was preparing a budget, I want to persuade the person reading it that I'd done my planning, that I'd thought through what I was seeking to do, and I'd want to persuade them or convince them that the project was going to be sustainable. So as well as obviously funds raised already, and hopefully the funds coming from Benefact Trust, I'd want to give a clear indication of other funders that I'd applied to. So really we want to know what secured funding you've got in place, and that is what needs to contribute towards the 30%. But we also need to see a plan for how you're going to raise the balance. As I said earlier, Benefact Trust will only give a contribution towards the overall project costs, so it's important to know that you've got a plan to raise those other funds. And also once our funding and any other funding comes to an end, it's important to know that the project will be sustainable, so you've thought ahead beyond the funding period.
Paul, do you mind explaining the difference between secured and unsecured funding?
Secured funding is basically grants that you've received, or that you've received a confirmation from the funder that you're going to get the funds. Unsecured funding might be grants that you've applied for, but at this moment in time you're still waiting to hear the outcome. It might be sort of pledges that aren't secured yet. So people, maybe in a church congregation have said, well, we think we can give you such and such, but they haven't confirmed that that is the case.
Paul, for someone like me who doesn't have any experience of this, what are the key components of a well-prepared budget?
Right, well, when we're sort of asking you to complete our budget template, and that's the first thing I should perhaps say is that, we actually have a budget template. So we try to make it really simple for beneficiaries and guide you every step of the way. So if you're completing our budget template, you'll see that we ask for the costs, and those can be capital costs, so the costs associated with buildings or sort of renovations, that sort of thing. And we also ask you to detail revenue costs if that's appropriate. And again, that would be staff costs, training costs, that sort of thing. So as I said earlier, they need to be really high level. So for example, the costs of a new children and families worker, or the salary for a new assistant project manager or something like that. Training to help ensure volunteers are able to do what they're being required to do and have all that training.
So you've given some really helpful tips there. I was wondering if you could share what common mistakes an applicant might make when it comes to budgeting for a project, and how they might avoid these mistakes.
One common mistake is actually when the budget template form which you complete doesn't correspond to the figures that you actually enter into the application form. And if that happens, then it means that the grants officer has to get in touch with the applicant, and that just delays the process of assessing an application. Another mistake that people make, and I've mentioned it already, is assuming that just because we ask for 30% of the funding to be in place, we will fund the balance. That certainly isn't the case. We will contribute towards the overall project cost, but we really need to see a strong plan for funding the balance in addition to any funding that Benefact Trust may contribute.
Thanks, Paul. And as you say, they seem like quite obvious mistakes, but actually if someone's time poor and they're doing an application and they're juggling 100 different things, these helpful tips will actually make their life a lot easier so that they can avoid making these errors.
Absolutely. As I say, they're simple things, but sometimes when you've got a number of applications to complete, it can be easy to lose sight of the simple things. So yeah, just simple mistakes, but simple to remedy them as well. Yeah.
So Paul, you've talked about sustainability quite a lot, and about ensuring that there's longevity in the projects that we support. So say I'm an applicant and I've prepared my project budget. I've gone on to apply and I've received a grant. I was wondering if you could share some best practices when it comes to managing and reporting on a grant once it's been received.
So for example, some of the grants we award are multi-year grants over 2 or 3 years. And before subsequent payments can be made, we require that a progress report is submitted. Now, the letter that you received telling you about the grant would have included a progress report template which you can complete, and also it will tell you when those progress reports are required. Now, we won't release any subsequent payments until we receive that progress report, so it's really important that you keep the progress report template somewhere safe so you can access it easily, but also you make a note of when those reports are due, because that's obviously important to you to ensure that your continual funding is coming through. And it's also important, or certainly advisable, to familiarise yourself with that template, because some of the questions that it asks are linked specifically to the outcomes that you specified on your application, and we'll be asking for key pieces of information related to those outcomes. Now, it may be that it would be helpful to monitor the project throughout the year and collate that information on an ongoing basis, rather than just coming to complete the project report and then thinking, oh my goodness, what do I put in here, and having to scrabble around for the information. So have the progress report to hand, know what questions you're going to be asked in it, and then during the year you can keep record of the information that report requires.
So you've given some really, really helpful information there, which I think will be helpful for people preparing a budget for Benefact Trust, but also looking to apply to other funders. And I wondered if we could end the podcast by just highlighting a few other potential funders that are out there for churches and charity projects.
So in addition to any local funding available, there are 4 potential funders which I just highlight. The first one is the Christian Funders Forum. As the name suggests, it's a forum of funders that will support Christian and church-related projects. Another one is Funds Online. Then there's 360 Giving. And finally, I'd suggest My Funding Central.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a pleasure to have you back on the podcast and hope to have you again soon.
It's my pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Beyond Funding. If you'd like to find out more about Benefact Trust and our grants, visit benefacttrust.co.uk. And to keep up to date with all our latest podcasts, subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels.